It's almost time for me to hand over to John, but just a few words about him first. He's been part of the advisory group for the Joy in Enough program for a number of years, and as you probably know, Joy in Enough is a program that's advocating for change in the way our economy works, one which prioritizes human need over profit and doesn't exceed the planetary boundaries we have. It's working with churches, with Christians, to add a Christian perspective to the growing calls for change. John has been a research scientist. He's an ordained priest in the Church of England, and he recently retired from a senior leadership role in the Diocese of Hereford. So we're very grateful, John, that you've stepped forward to give us this talk, and now over to you.
John, thank you for that introduction, and welcome to you all. It's really good to be with you this evening. The first thing to say, in terms of full disclosure, as John's implied there really, is that I am not an economist, right? So my background is in the natural sciences. I worked for a short while as a software engineer before I was ordained. So my qualifications for this evening's talk are fairly minimal. The good news, therefore, I think, is that hopefully you won't find it too taxing. But let me just share with you initially, what I'm going to talk to you about this evening, I think, is something I should have been taught when I was in school, quite frankly, because some of the basics about what money is and how it works are so fundamental, I think, to exercising responsible citizenship, quite apart from exercising responsible discipleship as a Christian. So what we're going to go through this evening is going to be pretty standard, what I would take to be textbook stuff. I don't think I'm not going to be aiming to say anything at all contentious. Hopefully to be engaging and entertaining along the way. It is very much about setting the scene to help us understand really what this thing, which we think we understand very well because we use it every day, this thing called money, really is. And what's it there for? What's it there to do? And as John suggested, Jesus and the magic money tree, Jesus will make an appearance on one or two occasions, you'll be glad to know. And there will also be a special guest appearance from the magic money tree towards the end of the talk. So see if you can spot that when it comes up. I'm now going to try to share my screen with you. So money, what is it? What does it do? These are the basic questions I want us to think about this evening. And there at the bottom of the screen is the URL that you can go to if you want to download a PDF for the presentation I'm going to share with you this evening. I'll put that up again at the end of the presentation so you can copy that. .org resources, talks and sermons, and it's there at the top of the list at the moment. So if you don't manage to absorb, there's quite a lot of slides actually. If you don't manage to absorb it all, don't panic, because it's all there for you. Okay, so I want to actually ask you a few questions along the way as well this evening, just to see where you're coming from, rhetorical questions, given the nature of the evening. But let's kick off with a deceptively simple question, perhaps. Which of these objects do you think has not been used as money at some time in the past, somewhere by somebody? So the first object there is stones. The next picture is clamshells, mackerel pouches, tobacco, and poker chips. Which of these items do you think has not been used as money by someone somewhere at some point in the past? It's a motley selection, isn't it? And I'm afraid I've kicked off by asking you a trick question, because the answer is actually they've all been used as money, specifically money in the sense of a means of exchange. And that's the first of the functions of money that I wanted to mention this evening. One of the things money does is to provide us with a means of exchange, something that a person will accept in return for goods and services. And as a means of exchange, basically, what you need in money is the capacity to carry it around with you, and also to have enough of it around circulating in the economy to permit all the transactions that people might need to make. So you might wonder where all these things were used as money. Well, just very briefly, so clamshells or wampum, for example, were used in North America as legal tender back in the 16th and 17th centuries. Whereas pouches of mackerel, this day, so I understand, used in US prisons as a kind of informal money to pay for haircuts, to settle gambling debts. I put etc. in there because I'll allow your imagination to fill in what else it might be used for. Cigarettes, packets of cigarettes had been used previously, apparently, but they were banned in 2004. Whereas tobacco served as legal tender in Virginia and Maryland for almost 200 years, longer than the international gold standard managed to last at that time. And depositors were charged for keeping their tobacco money in warehouses, where, of course, it would slowly deteriorate. And that, of course, encouraged people to spend their money, to spend the tobacco, or I suppose an extremist to smoke it. And poker chips, or to be more accurate, porcelain counters from local gambling houses, were used as money in some cities in Siam, in Thailand, in the 19th century. And apparently, if one of these casinos went bust, it would send a town crier around to announce that anyone holding its tokens had up to 3 days to redeem them. And finally, disc-shaped stones, known as fei, were used as currency in the Yap group of islands in the Pacific up until the 1960s, as recently as that. And some of them, as you can see, were pretty huge. That one in the middle, I think, is about a yard or so across. And they used to drill holes through the middle of them so they could stick poles through to wheel them around from place to place, so that it could actually physically function as a means of exchange, improbable though that sounds. So that leads on to the first answer to the question, what is money? And that answer is that money is a commodity. In other words, it represents the objective value of other things like land and labor, the processes of production, the things that go into making stuff. And this, if you like, is the kind of the mainstream view of what money is. And it's been held by lots of distinguished people going back through history, people as otherwise diverse in their views as Adam Smith and Karl Marx. View is commodity. Money is itself intrinsically valuable as a proxy for other commodities, and that's why precious metals have been made into coins, silver and gold, and they have at various times in human history functioned as money in the definitive sense, if you will. Although interestingly, the earliest known coins that have been recovered date back to no further back than the 7th century BC. And the biblical shekel, for example, was originally the weight of silver, equivalent to a bushel of barley. So according to the commodity theory of money, people originally devised money as a way of escaping the limitations that go with simple barter transactions. So to take a very obvious example, really, if I want an orange, right, and all I have to offer is bananas, but the person holding the oranges doesn't want bananas, then we have a problem. There's not going to be an economic exchange. But if both of us can agree on a third, if you like, kind of general purpose commodity, let's call it money, which we all happen to want, then life becomes much easier for everyone. This is the standard commodity theory. Of course, if you've got a gold coin, that isn't intrinsically very useful, though, in itself, is it? I mean, you can't eat it, for example. You can't make it into clothing. You can't, create a shelter out of it. But as money, it can be exchanged for other things which are useful. And also, it can be exchanged with anyone, including strangers and people who you don't trust. And in that sense, money is quite, it as a commodity is quite different to a simple IOU. I mean, you would only accept an IOU, I imagine, from somebody who you knew, who you planned to see again, and whom you kind of pretty much trusted. So in summary, according to the commodity theory of money, money represents the use value of other intrinsically useful things. Okay, time for another question. So which units of account did the accountants of Homer's day use? We're now talking about the 8th century BC. So back in Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, you know, those great stories, great epics. The accountants of Homer's day, what units did they count in? Did they count in bronze axes? That's what you got there in the bottom right-hand corner. Or was that the unit they used? Or did they use the drachma? On the other hand, did they use heads of cattle as the units of account? Or finally, did they use, you guessed it, wooden horses? And this does have a single correct answer. Which units of account did they use? Well, the answer is, perhaps improbably, they used heads of cattle as the units which they kept their accounts in. Now, there's no evidence that cattle were generally used as means of exchange in the same way that clamshells and tobacco were used in the example we looked at a moment ago. In other words, they didn't actually change hands routinely when an economic transaction took place, when something was bought and sold, but rather they provided a unit of account. It's essentially an abstract unity. Anything at all could be used as a unit of account, because a unit of account is essentially a bookkeeping device, which enables you and me to keep track of what's been bought and sold, and crucially importantly, who owes what to whom. And so we've got a picture here of chalk and cheese. So, I mean, as we know, famously, proverbially, there's nothing more different than chalk and cheese. And yet, because of money as a unit of account, they can be brought into a kind of equivalence. Money as a unit of account provides a kind of, like a kind of common yardstick against which, in principle, absolutely anything can be measured. And I guess that's why Aristotle called money the middle term, for it measures all things. So money as a unit of account is really sheer quantity, abstracted from all qualitative associations, which enables us therefore to give relative values in the same language, as it were, to things which are as different as chalk and cheese, as different as, I don't know, vacuum cleaners and grapefruit and you know, holidays in the Cotswolds. You know, whatever it is, potentially has a money value expressed in terms of unit of account. It can be added, literally arithmetically added together, or subtracted, or and so forth. So this links into the second answer to the question, what is money? And the answer here is that money is a system of credit and debt. Now, the Mesopotamian code of Hammurabi, which dates back to the early part of the 2nd millennium BC, indicates that money was originally a kind of an accountancy system, which was specifically created in order to keep track of resources and to record what was owed to whom. Now, there was silver held in the royal treasury, but seemingly it seldom changed hands. So in general, instead, what people did was they feel like they ran up tabs during the course of the year, which are denominated in silver. But these tabs were settled up usually at harvest time, again, not usually through payment in silver, but in something else, which was commonly available, like barley, or in fact anything which the creditor was willing to accept in payment. So this is an example of money functioning as an IOU, and this is in essence, the token of a social bond between a creditor and a debtor. Now notice that as an IOU, money need not have any intrinsic value. I mean, I could write you an IOU on a scrap of paper now, I mean, which has no intrinsic value. But nonetheless, it could function, if it was transferable around the community more generally, as money. And this is an example of what's called the credit theory of money, where money is really about social relations, first and foremost. And the key insight of credit theory is this, that money is not itself wealth, but rather a claim on wealth. And the example that's often given of this is, imagine you're Robinson Crusoe, you're stuck on a desert island, you could have a treasure chest crammed full of golden doubloons, all the money in the world, and yet you would have no wealth whatsoever, because it would be of no use to you whatsoever. The wealth that would be available to you on the desert island would be coconuts and fish and the wood to make a shelter, the basic things that make life possible. So the golden doubloons in your treasure chest would only become useful to you once you were re-immersed in society, because money isn't wealth itself, it's a claim on wealth, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And this really is a good point to just mention in passing. LETS schemes, local exchange and trading systems, local currencies, which exist in various forms around the country at the moment. I noticed actually that the Bristol pound has recently been withdrawn for interesting reasons on the back of lockdown, seemingly, and the fact that people weren't able to get around and exchange it very much, obviously over the last few months. But local exchange and trading systems, LET schemes, local currencies have flourished typically across the years in communities, particularly when the national currency, the official currency, is in short supply. So in times of recession, or maybe when a large local employer has closed down. And time banks, again, are a good example of this kind of system of credit and debt circulating within local communities. Time banks enable people who are relatively money poor in terms of the national currency, but time rich, to exchange in goods and services which otherwise they might not be able to afford. Now, there's an important point made by the credit theory of money here. And in fact, historians and anthropologists have borne out, I think, the truth of this claim, because the credit theory of money asserts that actually credit and debt were probably the earliest form of economic transaction, not, as the advocates of the commodity theory have traditionally argued, barter. Contrary to popular belief, barter, the simultaneous exchange of one item for another, is probably a relatively recent invention. David Graeber says this: we did not begin with barter, then discover money, and then eventually develop credit systems. It happened precisely the other way around. Barter has mainly been what people who are used to cash transactions do when, for one reason or another, they have no access to currency. That's a very significant insight. And if you've read David Graeber's book, which is on the reading list at the end, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, he goes into that and labors that point at some length. But it's an important one and quite a significant one, I think. Let's go back to there. So another question for you. What weight of sterling silver could you buy for £1 in cash in around 1900? What weight of sterling silver do you think you could have bought for £1 back in 1900? Would it have been £1 in weight? Would it have been £4 in weight? Would it have been 4 ounces? Or would it have been none at all? Again, there is a single correct answer to this. What do you reckon the answer might be? There's kind of a common sense answer, which isn't quite correct. The actual answer, the correct answer, is 4 ounces, but that is a slightly trick question, because Had I asked you the same question, but dating it back to the 8th century, £1 in weight would have been exactly right. Because back in the 8th century, King Offa, who built a dike round about the part of the world these days, he decided to mint 240 silver pennies out of exactly £1 of silver. That was his standard. And Charlemagne over on the continent was doing exactly the same thing at around the same time, establishing a currency standard. But over the course of the years, over the course of the centuries, as these things do, the silver content of these pennies had been successfully debased. In other words, there was other cheaper metals being mixed in with them, copper typically. So when Elizabeth I came to the throne, she decided it was time to reset the standard. So she established a standard exchange rate of 4 ounces of sterling silver to the pound in 1560. Her father, Henry VIII, had been shockingly bad at debasing the coinage in order to release silver to pay his mercenaries who were traditionally making war against the French, as has always been the case. But this standard, this exchange rate standard that Elizabeth established of 4 ounces to the pound, lasted until World War I, an extraordinary record. And that's interesting because it happened despite the fact that the actual silver content of pound coins during those 350 years did actually vary considerably, but the exchange rate remained the same. And what that meant was that the pound sterling, as it came to be known, served as a very good store of value over that period, because you knew if you had a pound in your pocket, regardless of how much actual silver was in it, you could go and exchange it at the Royal Mint for 4 ounces of actual proper kosher silver, and that economically was highly advantageous. And in case you're wondering, I'm told that modern pound coins contain no silver at all. So there we are. We live in dark days, don't we? So this is the third function of money, which is money functioning as a store of value. And because of that, again, that's one of the reasons that silver and gold have been popular choices to function as money over the years in coin form. That's partly because obviously the amount of silver and gold out there is in limited supply. I mean, occasionally there are big new finds, there's a gold rush, but by and large, there's a limited supply of these metals. So they function well as a store of value, and equally, of course, they last a long time. They don't decay like the tobacco you might have stored in your warehouses in Virginia, or the grain that was used in ancient Egypt, for example, as money. So again, for both those reasons, precious metals have been regarded as a good store of value over the years, good things to make your money out of. And that means, of course, if something's a store of value, I can actually accumulate it over time. I can build up value over time, secure in the knowledge that I've only the thief and the taxman to fear. Well, I say that, actually, there is one other threat as well, and it was one that Jesus identified, as I'm sure you'll remember, in his parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12. You remember the story. The farmer has this kind of amazing bonanza harvests, so good. He has to build all kinds of additional barns to store his harvest in, and he thinks to himself, brilliant, I've got it sorted now, I am complete. He says, soul, you have many ample goods laid up for many years, he says. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So he goes to bed happy. Sadly, that's the last time he went to bed. And of course, Jesus' observation is that all the value he had ostensibly stored up during the day disappeared overnight. And you can supply your own sermon there. I think it's pretty self-evident. So let's just recap. We're halfway through. Let's recap where we've got to so far. Money provides 3 things: a means or a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. So some textbooks tell you it also functions as a means of final payment, although that can really be assimilated, I think, into the unit of account function fairly unambiguously. So let's keep it simple. 3 is a good number, and that, I think, is a helpful kind of steer into the different functions which money performs for us. But, and this turns out to be a really, really important question, money can do 3 things, but can it do them all at once? Can it juggle all 3 functions equally well at the same time? And here I would like to commend to you a particular edition of Radio 4's Start the Week program, which was broadcast originally back in January 2012. It's worth listening to all 45 minutes of it, and there's the URL there, which again you can get from the PDF of this if you go to the website. Fascinating program, I think, but particularly the first 8 minutes, where Andrew Marr interviews Philip Coggan of The Economist, who at that point had just brought out a new book called Paper Promises. And in the course of the interview, he expands on one very basic but really, really important point, which I'm just going to try to run through for you now. So one of the things Philip Philip says is money has to be 2 very, very different things at the same time. And in particular, he's drawing attention here to the tension between the role of money as a means of exchange on the one hand, and as a store of value on the other. Now, why is that? Well, money as a means of exchange, you'll remember, there needs to be plenty of money out there in circulation in order for people to engage in all the various economic transactions they might want to engage in. So from that point of view, the more money there is out there in circulation, the better. So there's pressure from that point of view for the central bank to be forever creating more money. And that's particularly favoured as a policy, naturally favoured by people who are in debt. Because if you're in debt, you want to know that there's plenty of money sloshing around there in the economy that you can access in order to be able to service your debts. So if you're a debtor, if you're a borrower, then you really favour the role of money as a means of exchange, particularly because you want to see more and more of it appearing from day to day. But on the other hand, if rather than being a debtor, you're a creditor, rather than being a borrower, you're a saver or a lender, then actually what really matters to you is that the money you've got in the bank retains its value. So the store of value function becomes crucially significant for you. And because of that, you will not be at all keen on the idea of the supply of money increasing, because the more money that goes into the economy relative to the number of goods and services that are out there to be bought and sold, then the less your money is going to be worth. We're talking about inflation here. So as you can see straight away there's a tension, a social tension between these 2 basic functions of money. So borrowers, be they, a young couple buying their first house, or be it a business person who's wanting money to put into a new business venture, they're really keen to see the money supply expanded. Whereas savers, we really don't like that. We really don't like it when the government puts the printing presses onto overdrive, because that means that the value of the money that we have is going to go down. Our precious savings slipping through our hands. So here's a quote from Philip here. Over the last 40 years or so, he says, we have had no constraints on the creation of money. This has been good news, in other words, for borrowers. And a lot of this money has been used to buy assets, in other words, houses and stocks and shares, basically. So the result is we've had this series of bubbles in which borrowed money has been used to buy houses, shares, whatever. And every time the result of that has been that the finance sector has expanded very rapidly. So Wall Street, which is really the financial sector epitomized. I mean, we could read the City of London into there and all the equivalent financial hubs around the world. Wall Street now depends on the central bank, the Bank of England in our case, to prop up asset markets, to keep prices high. Because if suddenly the prices of houses fall or the stock exchange crashes, then how on earth is all that money going to get paid back? You know, we've lost, effectively, those who borrowed money are massively in the red. And in the red there at the bottom, a good summary, I think, of our current situation. We've created more claims on wealth than we have wealth itself. That's the problem. And you remember, that was a useful distinction that the credit theory of money offered to us, this distinction between claims on wealth and wealth itself. Basically, we've created more money than there is stuff to buy money with, to put it very crudely. And that, Philip suggests, is the dilemma we find ourselves in during this, well, it's now the third decade of the 21st century. So where do we go from here? Well, he says, we're not going to be paying these debts back. It's as simple as that. They are not going to be paid back. So what are our options collectively? Well, there are just two. One is default. We just walk away from the debts. And the second is inflation. We basically turn on those printing presses, put them into overdrive, and allow money to lose its value. Whichever way we play it, both of these are, when you think about it, ways of reneging on past promises. Promises to because obviously if inflation takes off, then even if nominally somebody repays their debt, because the value, the purchasing power of the money they're paying their debt back in is less than the purchasing power of the money they borrowed 5 years, 10 years ago, whatever it was. Effectively, the promise is not being fulfilled anymore, because in terms of purchasing power, the repayment doesn't really hold water. It doesn't carry the weight it should do. And that final quote at the bottom of the page there, one way or another, something negative will happen. And that's an interesting reflection, I think, to carry with us as we reflect on the global financial situation that we find ourselves in today still. So let's do some recapping. What is money? So far, I've shared two answers to that question with you. First of all, money can be seen as a commodity, a proxy commodity, which represents the use value of other useful things. And secondly, money functions as a social bond, a system of credit and debt between people. But there's one further answer to the question, what is money, which I think it's important for us to take into account. And it's this: money can also be seen as whatever the government will accept in payment of taxes. Is that across the centuries, rulers have always been short of cash, particularly if they decide to go to war, which historically has happened not seldom. And that's because they need to pay their troops. And, you know, troops, particularly if they're mercenaries, are very accepting IOUs. They want hard cash in precious metals. Traditionally, that's what's happened in the past. And so kings have historically often found themselves in the hands of moneylenders because they need that hard cash to pay their troops. Of course, another way of basic revenue is through taxation. And this has been a major source of revenue for rulers throughout history. Now, traditionally, of course, a local landowner might have accepted, you know, a proportion of his tenants' harvest as a tithe. But a distant emperor might well prefer tribute to be paid in coinage for the reasons I've just mentioned. And this has led conquerors to impose a cash economy on the inhabitants of conquered lands in order to expedite the payment of tax. And for example, in Ghana in the 19th century, the British Empire imposed a hut tax, on the local folk living in that country. In a context where there was a very simple self-sustaining economy already in place, where the pound sterling didn't feature at all. But suddenly people found they were being presented with tax bills which had to be paid in sterling. It was, I think, 1 shilling per annum to start with, not a great deal, but nevertheless, people suddenly needed to access shillings, and so were dragged perforce into a cash economy which operated on that basis. And the self-sustaining economy, which had been in operation in that part of the world for time out of mind, gradually withered away because suddenly people had to work in order to earn money in terms of pound sterling to pay as tax. So this is the so-called state theory of money. We've talked about the commodity theory and the credit theory. This is the state theory of money, sometimes known as chartalism, which says that money is essentially whatever the state will accept as tax payment. And bearing that in mind, I think it's quite interesting, therefore, to look again at what's printed on every single banknote that you and I have ever handled, which is the Bank of England's chief cashier promising to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5 or whatever. According to the state theory of money, what that really translates as is the government promises to accept this £5 note as partial settlement of your tax bill. So that's an interesting alternative perspective on money, which isn't necessarily obvious. And one question that it might raise for us is, well, okay, where does that leave local currencies? Those let schemes, you know, the Bristol pound, these time bank currencies that we mentioned earlier on, you know, local currencies that the state has no involvement in. Where does that leave them? Well, let me tell you a story which illustrates what can happen to local currencies if they get too successful. Back in Germany during the 1920s, famously, there was hyperinflation and tremendous economic hardship as a result of that. Businesses were closing down left, right, and center. And so some businessmen in a town called Schwannenkirchen in Germany decided to create their own local currency, in effect, which just circulated between themselves. It's called the Währer, I think that's pronounced as. And it proved very successful. It enabled the local coal mine to reopen, for example, and it just generally revitalized the local economy because people were getting back into work again and so forth. It was so successful, in fact, that it began to be adopted further afield. And as I understand it, more than 2,000 businesses across Germany eventually ended up using the Währer as a means of exchange between themselves. However, the German central bank came to see the Währer and other local currencies similar to that which was springing up at the time as a threat to the status of the national currency, the Reichsmark at the time. And as a result, all these local currencies were declared illegal in 1931. Interestingly, a similar currency in Austria suffered exactly the same fate around the same time. But another currency in Switzerland called the Wehr, operating on exactly the same basis pretty much, managed to survive that era, and as I understand it, is still in use amongst Swiss companies to this day. If we had more time, I would love us to do a Bible study at this point, because the state theory of money, I think, casts an entirely new light on a passage which we'll all be familiar with, Mark chapter 12. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? The key thing about this particular exchange between Jesus and his interlocutors is that the taxes paid to the emperor had to be paid in Roman coinage, the denarius, not in the itty-bitty shekels and other random bits of Middle Eastern currency that did the rounds amongst ordinary people in Palestine at that time. And therefore, there is a question there about the authority of the person who is requiring this tax payment, which leads on in Jesus's exchange with his interlocutors to the whole question of where our ultimate authority is lie. Give unto Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, but give unto God what belongs to God. So again, something to ponder there and reflect on when read through the lens of chartalism, the state theory of money. And that's just a slide on the Roman business model, which has been repeated by many other empires over the course of history, essentially exploiting their core provinces as ways of extracting raw materials, goods to be consumed in the imperial center, but also as a way of extracting tax payment, which is crucial if you want to maintain your army, because as we noticed earlier, that's what rulers are really keen to do, to keep their armies paid so they can maintain order, not only in the core provinces, but also in those frontier provinces, troublesome places. Do you remember, like Britannia, where the army is required to act as a cordon sanitaire, keeping the barbarian hordes at bay? And that's a popular business model for empires throughout history. Now, of course, the state need not require its taxes to be paid in metallic coins. It could require us to pay our taxes in whatever medium it chooses. For example, it could print and distribute its own IOUs and then insist that taxes be paid with them. And that's exactly how things have been across the world since 1971, when President Nixon took the United States off the latest version of the gold standard, and the financial regime that had been in place ever since the end of the Second World War collapsed. Since then, we've been living in what James Buchan, who's the author of one of the books on the reading list, calls, we've been living in a floating world and in a fiat money system, which basically means a system in which the government declares a particular currency, which isn't backed by anything else. It simply is money because the government says it is. It defines that as legal tender. So we normally live in a fiat money system where the value of money isn't anchored in the value of gold or silver or anything else at all. Each national currency, or not all currencies are national, of course, but each currency is effectively free floating with respect to all the others. And we're drawing to a close now. On the back of that, I want to mention something to you, which I think is quite a significant development at the moment. And it's a form of the state theory of money, or chartalism, and it's called modern money theory, or modern monetary theory, and it's associated with gentlemen like this. This is Randall Wray, or I believe his friends call him Randy, slightly improbably. Randy Wray. He's written a book called Modern Money Theory, and I just want to run through some of the basic postulates of this, because a lot of people have become very interested in this over the last few years for reasons which will perhaps become apparent. So the first claim of modern money theory is that nations which operate a fiat money system, which I've just mentioned, and issue their own sovereign currencies can never run out of money. In other words, they can always instruct their central banks to print more money, whether that's hard cash or electronic money, in order to meet any needs for additional funding that arise. So basically, fiat money systems which operate their own sovereign currencies, that would include ourselves in the UK, for example, the US, Japan, most other countries. Interestingly, significantly, not the Eurozone countries, of course, where monetary sovereignty has been vested in the European Central Bank, as they discovered in Greece, for example, to their considerable cost about 10 years ago. So this is where the magic money tree comes in. In effect, these countries, or each one of them, has a magic money tree which can bear fruit at will. And I think it was Amber Rudd, wasn't it, back in 2017, when she was in a debate leading up to the general election with Jeremy Corbyn about his party's spending plans. She mocked him because he was acting as if there was some kind of magic money tree out there somewhere that you could simply conjure money out of thin air from and spend it at will. Obviously, a crazy idea was the implication there. Well, it turns out that according to modern money theory, in a sense, Corbyn was absolutely right. However, and there is a major caveat here, if the money that's produced and spent is not put to productive use, according to MMT, then indeed inflation can become a problem. And you can see why that would be. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you've got more and more money out there chasing a limited number of goods and services, then the value of each unit of money will decrease. And that's inflation, folks. And if we're savers, we do not like inflation, do we? Not at all. So we register that caveat. So you might think then, well, okay, if the government can produce as much money as it wants to at the drop of a hat, then why on earth do we need to pay taxes? Because didn't people always tell us the reason we had to pay taxes was in order to give the government money so they could then spend it on stuff like, hospitals and education and armies and things like that? Well, according to modern monetary theory, of course, they don't need to raise taxes for that purpose because they don't need to generate funds. But the main purpose of taxation is really a political one. It's to oblige citizens to acquire and to use the state's fiat currency. In principle, exactly the same as what the British Empire did in Ghana back in the 19th century. It's basically to show who's boss. You could almost imagine the local mafiosi coming in and implementing a similar system, where each week we come around to collect our dues, our tribute money, and if it's not in the units that we want it to be paid, in the medium we want it to be paid, if it's not paid, well, accidents can happen, and we don't want that, do we? So finally, under this heading, I just want to mention to you something which, again, has been talked about increasingly over the last few years, and that's helicopter money. Essentially, as I think we all realize, the global economy has been stuck in a rut in large measure since 2008. And conventional methods have proved completely incapable of releasing this from this rut. So people are starting to talk about all kinds of crazy ideas. Things like negative interest rates, for example, which have in fact been implemented here and there, and have been for some time now. Crazy idea. Negative interest rates, how on earth could that possibly work? Well, so far it hasn't really worked, but people have tried it. Another idea that's been mentioned is something called helicopter money, basically raining down money from on high from the central banks into the pockets of ordinary people like you and me. Again, essentially as a way of trying to promote economic activity and as a way of somehow resolving the great stagnation in which we've lived since 2008. Now, if you or somebody you know has been in receipt of a furlough payment over the course of the last 2 years, then just maybe they've had the first taste of what helicopter money might end up being like. Another term that you hear more and more about these days is universal basic income, where the helicopter money drop becomes not just a one-off kind of Christmas present, it becomes something regular that goes into your bank account every month, potentially. And a number of radical, including green economists, have talked very positively about the potential role of universal basic income, these regular helicopter money drops in a future economy. Now, there's a whole different session to be had, at least, around the pros and the cons of that. But I just wanted to flag it up now because, as I said, this little bit of economic theory, financial theory, could be coming to a bank account somewhere near you before too long. So let's wrap up. What is money? I've suggested there are 3 possible answers to that question. Money as a commodity, a proxy for other commodities. Money as credit and debt, a relationship, a social relationship, characterized, a relationship between creditors and debtors, and money as taxation, whatever the government happens to accept as taxes. And you can see there's 3 different dimensions I'm trying to illustrate in that diagram there. A horizontal relationship between creditors and debtors, a vertical relationship to the world of stuff, the world that we actually want to buy and which is useful, but also a vertical relationship to the political authority under which we operate. So that's just the same thing expressed in a different way. And then just to recap the three things that money does alongside this. It acts as a means or medium of exchange, it provides a store of value, and it provides a unit of account. But crucially, as Philip Coggan pointed out, a single money system can struggle to do all these three things at once, in particular to hold in balance the means of exchange function and the store of value function. And if you want to think some more about that last point in particular, I commend to you the third book on the reading list there, which is Richard Douthwaite's The Ecology of Money. Happily, now available in an online version free of charge, because one of the things that Richard Douthwaite does in that very small, very manageable, very informative little book is argue for the need for a plurality of monies in circulation, so that some of the monies can, as it were, so specialize in the store of value function, but existing alongside other monies which are more suited to function as means of exchange, and having various exchange mechanisms in place that enable people to convert their money from one currency to another. And he's got a scheme that he puts forward suggesting how that might look. So commend that to you. James Buchan, I mentioned, Frozen Desire, a beautiful book, a really extended meditation on the history of money and what it does to people. A delight to read. Philip Coggan's book on Paper Promises, I mentioned. David Graeber's book, Death, the First 5,000 Years. Again, incredibly influential book. David Graeber passed away quite recently, sadly. But the patron saint, really, of the Occupy movement 10 years ago. And Jeffrey Ingham's book, The Nature of Money, a more academic book, but again, accessible and a super overview, arguing in particular for the credit and the state theories of money. If you want to find out more about modern monetary theory and where possibly our global financial system is heading, I commend to you Stephanie Kelton's book on that, which I think is pretty accessible, come out very recently. The New Economic Perspectives website also has a great deal of material on MMT. And if you just want a quick kind of bite-sized overview, looking at the pros and the cons of modern monetary theory, there's a very useful website article there from Bloomberg News, March 2019. So I think that brings my slides to an end. There you go. And there's that website address again, if you want to check on that and get hold of it. So let me just stop sharing at this point. There we go.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much, John, for a very interesting and informative talk. We have, I think, let's say, quarter of an hour for questions. I hope everyone can stay on. There's been a lot of questions posed, and so I will just try and offer some quick samples of the questions. So, I mean, a fundamental question for you, John, is it really money that's the problem, or is it inequality?
Money or inequality?
Yeah.
In the sense that some people have got too much money and some people haven't got enough. That's a really interesting question, isn't it? If you haven't read David Graeber's book on debt, talking to all of you, please read it. It is utterly fascinating. It's a huge, thick book. It looks like this. They've just bought out a new edition, 500 pages long. They just bought out another edition, which has got a foreword by Thomas Piketty, I think. One of the things that comes through there is that if you look back even at ancient history, time after time after time, sections of society, wherever you look around the world, have got themselves into chronic debt. And you've ended up with people who precisely got that, too much money, and a large majority usually who haven't got enough. And the biblical principle of Jubilee that we read about in Leviticus turns out to be a very practical program which has been implemented historically, not just in Israel, but across the ancient world, perforce from time to time, because essentially society has got to a point where politically outstanding debts simply had to be cancelled. It was just, people just could not go on. So, I mean, one of the interesting questions, therefore, for us, I suppose, as Christians is it time for a new Jubilee? And some of us, I suspect, were involved in the Jubilee 2000 movement back in the day. And the Jubilee campaign continues. One of the difficulties we have, though, practically these days, is that if Jubilee is implemented, in other words, if there's a mass default of existing debts, one of the things that will mean is that the assets which those debts represent to people who are the creditors will disappear straight away. And unfortunately, many of the people who hold those assets are pension funds. And those of us who are benefiting from pensions at the moment or hope to benefit from pensions in the future, I'm afraid, have a class interest in seeing our pension funds survive, I would suggest. So that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case back in ancient times. Wasn't the case in ancient Israel when Leviticus was written. Wasn't the case in ancient Greece when when mass debt cancellation happened. So the whole question of how you bring into equilibrium this is almost like a systemic tendency for a minority in any society to get richer over the course of time, and for the majority to gradually get poorer. The only occasions in recent history when that hasn't happened, again, this is Thomas Piketty's book Capital brings it out very well, is during times of strong economic growth, which we've enjoyed in the Western world for the most part since during the 20th century, and particularly during the 30 years straight after World War II. Unfortunately, as again many of us will realize, economic growth is strongly correlated to bad outcomes for the environment. And in any event, economic growth here in the Western world seems to have ground to a halt pretty much since the beginning of the century. So there's a massive question really about how we move to a more just place here. And the question of what kind of economic system, what kind of financial system specifically might expedite that is crucial. And this is where radical economists have started to talk about things like helicopter money, taking away from, and this is another issue we haven't had time to touch on, but taking away from commercial banks the power they currently have to create money, because most of the money that's in circulation in the economy was generated as interest-bearing debt by commercial banks. So many people have argued that's just not sustainable. We need to do away with that and go to a democratically controlled currency, which is issued centrally by the state via the central bank. Now, that's a really interesting idea. And again, one that we haven't got time to unpack at length here. Pros and cons once you start unpacking it in detail. But the question about social inequality and its relationship to the way to the money system we have in operation, I think, is a really crucial one. And well, yeah, I have no pat answer to it, but you've asked exactly the right question, whoever asked that.
Right, I'll just put a few more questions to you, John. So if money is a human construct, it can be whatever we decide it should be. But all the power to do so resides with, well, the powerful. So yeah. How can we have a form of money that works for the common good?
Absolutely. So again, democratic control over our money system is key there, isn't it? And it boils down, I think, to a tricky question, which ties in with Philip Coggan's observation about the fact that whether we like it or not, different groups of people in society do have different interests. And Jeffrey Ingham's book on the nature of money, I think, brings it out particularly clearly that money is inherently a political entity. And again, my observation about pension funds there hopefully rang a positive bell with us, because what that brings out is the fact that, you know, there are no good guys and bad guys in this, that most of us, dare I suggest, are heavily implicated in the current system, and moving towards a system which is ultimately fairer and which somehow structurally avoids the imbalances that tend to accrue over the course of time is not a straightforward task at all. There's some really interesting stuff that's been written. Again, Richard Douthwaite's book, little booklet, I do commend that to you. Do have a look at it online, very accessible. He sketches an outline of a more just financial system, which is inherently plural. That's a key thing, really, because what that potentially does is it automatically creates some kind of a balance between the interests of savers and borrowers in society in such a way that overall the best interests of most are honoured. Now, you know, that is a massive undertaking, but at least in outline, that's one particular model that I think it's worth pondering.
A few more questions before we really have to finish. Who determines the value of money today? Is it the rich, those with lots of money, who choose to pay as little as possible, the people who clean the streets, care for the sick, or resource the Amazon warehouses, and who pays lots for houses, cars, private jets, etc.? That question, who determines the value of money today?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a very good question, isn't it? Again, you're back to the fact that this is a political issue, which has to do with the varying interests of different classes of society that may hold the balance of power at any particular point. I mean, a lot of it has to do, I think, with if you think about money as credit rather than debt, although credit and debt are in a sense two sides of the same coin. It's interesting to pose the question in terms of who actually gets the credit, and I pose that question in a deliberately ambivalent way, really, because those for whom money represents credit means that there's a positive spin to that as well, one very interesting suggestion that's come out in recent times has been from an economist called Richard Werner, who has argued that we completely need to rejig the way the money system works, so that money increasingly is produced by rather an interesting method, really, through central government borrowing money from local banks. He thinks that one of the biggest problems we've got is we've got too many big banks that are really, really bad at lending money to small businesses. And that's become increasingly a problem over the last few years. And he argues that through establishing lots and lots and lots of little local banks, each one of them based on money that's been lent to the government, and that's the safest entity you can lend your money to, would be very well placed for encouraging local economies to thrive, producing relatively meaningful jobs for local people, and thereby, as you were, giving credit to the majority who can easily otherwise get overlooked completely, and you know, in the context of the huge global juggernaut which is modern money.
And finally, and thank you for all the questions. I'm going to feed them all to John, and this will also input to further thinking he's doing on what other talks related to this issue we could offer in the future, or maybe even a discussion resource. But final question: given all that we've heard this evening, how should we live? Is a question someone put.
Thank you for leaving the easiest question to last, John. That's generous of you. I think it's, I'll be honest with you, I think it's really hard. I mean, what it illustrates to me, if I can just give a roundabout answer to that, is it illustrates the extent to which we live in the realm of the principalities and powers. You know, that phrase that's used, I think, in Ephesians chapter 6. There's an American theologian called, he's got a great name, Walter Wink, I think it's pronounced, or Walter Wink, who written some super books on this, where he tries to interpret the New Testament notion of the principalities and powers in terms of the concrete political and economic realities which circumscribe the ways in which ordinary people like us, who are trying to lead good lives, actually live. Why is it that it's so hard to lead a good life? Not in terms of, you know, being nice to the big issue seller on the high street, but in terms of the way we unconsciously collude with economic systems which are oppressing large parts of our of the human population. So part of it, I think, is about looking very carefully at where our money is. If we're fortunate enough to have money, is to look at what control we have over the money that we have invested, thinking about very carefully where it's sitting, what's it being used for. I mean, these days, it's not easy to put your money anywhere where it's going to generate, where it's going to hold its value. Let's face it. I mean, certainly my ISA, I think ISAs are fairly ethically okay, aren't they? My ISAs, NS&I ISA, is decreasing in value every day because you know, inflation is what, 3%. I dread to think what interest rate I'm getting on nothing at all. The only way you can make money these days is by sticking it in the stock exchange, or by, if you've got that kind of money, investing it in property. And of course, that simply, apart from anything else, simply reinforces the whole kind of Ponzi scheme bubble dynamics that eventually is going to go pop once again, as it did in 2008. So it's about trying to steward our resources individually as well as we can, and trying to be aware of initiatives, a bit like Richard Werner's local bank initiative, for example, that are around, and trying to use whatever leverage we have individually in supporting those initiatives in order to create patterns of life for our neighbours which are sustainable and which are prosperous for them.
John, we could, I think, carry on this conversation a lot longer, and there really are some very interesting questions that we haven't had time to look at. But I think it's time now to draw this talk to a close. So thank you very, very much for spending time with us, John, and sharing your presentation. As John said, the presentation is available on the Join Enough website. Our next talk will be on Wednesday, the 15th of December, and it will be given by Jeremy Williams, who with Catherine Trebeck has written a very interesting book called The Economics of Arrival. So Jeremy will be talking about that book on the 15th of December, and I do hope that you'll be able to join us for that as well. So thank you very much. And John, thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you all for your company. Have a good evening.
Thank you.